My practice engages drawing and performance and pedagogical experiments and group work and social practice and organizing and publication. But in some ways, this project that I'm going to present to you tonight brings a lot of those things together in an odd way, and I'll go over it and why that is. When I work in the manner that I'm going to be presenting tonight, which is in publication, there are kind of three questions that I'm always asking myself. And those three questions are, how does text and textuality relate to people, creative practice, and social movements? What is the way theory informs practice? And how can ideas reproduce themselves? And the map is closed, but the autonomous zone is open. Metaphorically, it unfolds within the fractal dimensions invisible to the cartography of control. And here we should introduce the concept of psychotopology and topography as an alternative science to that of the state surveying and map making and psychic imperialism. And that's a quote from Hakim Bey's 1991 book, The Temporary Autonomous Zone. I began this project called the Llano del Rio Collective. And this talk, the rest of the talk kind of veers into this framing, which is about scoring the future city. And Llano del Rio is a project that is specifically about this experience of the way that a publication, when you put it on your face and you read it, that it becomes a lens or a way to see the world through. And I was really, really interested in that in starting both the journal and the Llano del Rio Collective. The Llano del Rio Collective aims to expand cultural, social, and political imagination of Los Angeles through the production of thematic guides, related events, and the hosting of a speakers bureau. We aim to frame practice rather than be a practice. The collective is engaged in prefigurative research, hence the title of this talk, Scoring the Future City, prefigurative research. The project draws its name from the socialist colony founded in California's Antelope Valley by Job Harriman in the early 20th century. So what Llano del Rio generally does is we publish these guides, and I'll talk more about them in depth. But central to Llano del Rio is distribution. It's a big thing. So our guides are free to Angelinos. People can contact us through the World Wide Web and give us their Los Angeles County-based address, and we will send them to them for no cost. When a guide is completed, we put them out in public places. And the public places can be just places where people can, generally expect to find free publications. But we also locate publications locate places to place them that are in sympathy with the theme of the guide. So there was a movement-based guide, and we specifically targeted yoga studios and dance studios to put the guides at. They are available for purchase. We distribute them at public events and projects and talks. And with distribution, the goal is to get rid of the editions, which are generally of 2,000 copies. And with the selling of them, the goal is to make enough money to cover the next project. So just to go back for a second, in graduating graduate school, I never was particularly interested in making money through art or publication, and I have found that distributing printed matter to be a very satisfying way to be out there in the world as an artist, because, oh my fucking God, there's like a lot more bookstores that do a lot more sales than there are art galleries. So the topic of this section of my talk is about scoring the future city. And of course here I'm referring to the work of Alan Kaprow's concept of scoring, where you have a set of text and that people perform it in a certain way. And for me, Kaprow's interesting because, quote, the line between art and life should be kept as fluid and perhaps as indistinct as possible. And then of course I'm drawn to the work of the situationists in their concept of the derive. And because Llano del Rio does ostensibly maps and we do ostensibly guides, a set of directions that give people a way to move through the cities. Lines up very well with this. In a derive, one or more persons during a certain period drop their relations, their work and leisure activities, and all their other usual motives for movement and action, and let themselves be drawn by the attractions of the terrain and the encounters they find there. So the Llano del Rio colony was an actual socialist colony that was in the high desert of northern LA County. At the time of its founding in 1914, the desert was a little moister than usual. So this guy, Job Harriman, who was a candidate for mayor, I believe in the year 1911, though don't quote me on that. Well, his backstory is they say he would have won the election perhaps, except that the LA Times was bombed right around the election time, and they blamed it on the anarchist element in Los Angeles. Many of them, curiously, actually being developed from the Mexican-American communities in the Mexican community. A lot of strong, the Magonistas were come out of the Mexican Revolution. Don't quote me on that. Anyway, that's a sidebar. Harriman would have won it. He was smeared by the LA Times. He lost, and he wanted to prove the veracity of socialism, so he founded this colony in the high desert, which then was moist. One other way that I like to think about scoring is the way that architecture informs one's movement and behavior in space. And Alice Constance Austin was the architect of the Llano del Rio colony. And she came up with a plan for the colony that was, she arranged administrative buildings, restaurants, churches, schools, markets, and so forth in a circular plan. Houses would be made of concrete, laid out in rows with alternative facades based on individual tastes. She created communal daycare areas and designed furniture that would be easy to clean, with no crevices for dust, rollaway beds, and heated tile floor rather than carpeted, all to cut down on housework. So Llano del Rio colony was designed by an early feminist architect. I love that touchstone. So the first guide that we produced in 2010 was the Map for Another Los Angeles. And the Map for Another Los Angeles is the most map-like guide that the Llano del Rio Collective has produced. So the Map for Another LA was inspired in part by a book by a Northern California writer named Chris Carlson, and particularly a book of his that was published by Autona Media, which is a Bay Area anarchist press. Nowtopia was published in 2008 in San Francisco. The other LA is ecological in concept, communitarian in nature, and perhaps it's post-political. It's practice-based. And when I say post-political, I'm drawing from loosely from the Italian autonomia movement, but more specifically my interpretation of it in 2010. And the projects that are mapped in the guide are not necessarily political in their approach. The practices inherently contain the politics. If you would put a politics on it, it could be broadly defined as anarchistic, but not everyone who is mapped in the guide would adhere to that. So some of the things that were located in this 2010 project were the Bicycle Kitchen in the Bicycle District of Los Angeles. So right around this time in Los Angeles, cycling really exploded as a social activity, as an alternative to automobile, and as a source of creative expression. And at the center of this was an organization called the Bicycle Kitchen. And literally they were trying to mix up a bicycle culture for Los Angeles that is so notoriously not bicycle friendly. There is a threatening song called Walking in LA, which is all about the horrors of being not in a car in Los Angeles. A social organization called the Backyard Beekeepers is located in the guide, and the Backyard Beekeepers is basically a group of hobbyists that promote beekeeping in Los Angeles. Lovecraft Biofuels was a business that was located in the extraordinarily trendy Silver Lake neighborhood of Los Angeles, at one of the most prominent, trendy corners of the city. And Lovecraft was a business that retrofitted cars with that used vegetable oil. And primarily, since it was Los Angeles, they primarily converted Mercedes-Benzes. And then around Lovecraft, which was a business, because they promoted it and they were extraordinarily good at it, there were all these other organizations that sprung up around Lovecraft that were doing collectives that were cleaning up fryer grease and distributing it. So all these other groups of people who are working both in their leisure time and trying to figure out how they can make these leisure activities become businesses to provide fuel, recycled fuel for these Mercedes-Benzes that were proliferating around town. So there was a good chunk of time in Los Angeles where you would literally see tons of Mercedes-Benzes with vegetable powered, and the city smelled just a little bit more like French fries at the time. And it's got these sets of texts that some of them are written by collective members, some of them are stuff that I had asked individuals to write that explore ways that people have moved or thought about moving in Los Angeles. So yeah, I'm not going to get into it. But I do want to say that none of this stuff on the front of the map is true. They're all lies. And I just liked having it out there that these stories around Los Angeles, that these myths could propagate themselves. One of the funnest myths for me was this one, which was an untrue story about a former Los Angeles politician who was a city councilman for the city of LA in 1996 when the movie Crash won the Academy Award for Best Picture. And Crash is a pretty awful movie. And it's awful for Los Angeles because it shows the city as a place where people, like all these different communities of LA, get together. And when they get together, there's no harmony. There's only discord. And when people come together, they just crash and fight one another. And the story propagated on this is that this city councilman wanted to counteract this discourse, and he dreamt up of a pageant of the city of LA that would take place at City Hall. And all the city would come together and represent their different neighborhoods, and they would have a joyous celebration where they would represent their neighborhood, and El Sereno would meet Beverly Hills, and they would all like represent themselves and dance together in harmony. But one of the curious things, even though it's a lie, and even though the text itself says that it never happened, the city ended up not funding it, but one of the things that did happen at City Hall within 6 months of the guide's publication was Occupy LA happened at City Hall. And that was a way that all of the city came together to occupy Los Angeles, the City Hall, and to represent their beliefs and represent their thoughts and represent themselves, to speak back to Hollywood and to speak back to the world on their belief about the financial crisis and a myriad of other issues. So, and this myriad of other issues is actually what I'm going to change focus onto right now, because as someone who participated in Occupy LA, the experience of Occupy LA was a little bit frustrating because it had taken on, and I'm going to be critical here, but I loved Occupy LA. But one of the things that was curious about this protest was, and a lot of Occupies things that variants of the Occupy movement in the United States was the non-desire to take a policy stance or to take an ideological position other than the representation of multiple grievances. And the belief in this just to characterize or mischaracterize something at this moment, this belief in this post-political position, that through the act of just representation, representing what you feel or what you want to do in your time, that might constitute a politics. I like to see this kind of thing as a laboratory for insurgent power. So I tend to not come down either way on it. I'm just interested in these as places for social antagonism, where people can exercise their use of power and their strategic organizing of power. So one thing that should be said about these protests is they were successful. In this area in Los Angeles, all the galleries that were targeted have moved out. And they would say it was other things, but it was largely these protests that drove them out. Now, I don't know if that's going to stop gentrification in the neighborhood or not, but they were successful. Finally, I want to just locate this. This is the Ovarian Psychos. They're located on the guide. They run this space called La Concha. And one of the things that's so exceptional about them is their intersectionality, their use of theory and practice, and style and fashion. They describe themselves as a girl gang, an anarcho-Marxist feminist, transportation advocates, sex educators, and ex-Sicanas, allies, and style icons. So this kind of thing where you have these kind of revolutionary subjects who are bringing together in these unique forms and in these unique languages and these very eye-catching things. This is the rebel city right here. This is it. Hands down. This is what the revolution looks like, is these multiple subjects performing multiple solutions with multiple ideologies, bringing the city together in an experimental new way. So ultimately, this is what we're declaring. So since the guide's production, LA City voted on Costa-Hawkins, the repeal of a bad rent control law. The tenants advocates lost that battle, but there's more battles to come. Charlie Beck was the main target of Black Lives Matter. Since the publication of the guide, Charlie Beck left, a major victory for Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. Since the publication of the guide, ice blockades have proliferated both in downtown Los Angeles and nationwide. Since the publication of the guide, the concept of a public bank is very, which is explained in the guide, is very much on the table and being explored both in the city of Los Angeles and throughout California. There have been many victories won by anti-displacement and anti-gentrification activists throughout the city of Los Angeles. So I have to ask again, are these just bright stars in a very dark sky? Or are they a developing network of constellations? So the guide presents a constellation of over 80 organizations actively growing grassroots power in diverse areas, from housing to finance to public safety. I said housing twice, and to food. This is a quote on the back that many of you have known. The person who wrote this essay is Tracy Jean Rosenthal, but it's actually a quote of Ursula Le Guin. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings. So that's the Rebel Cities Guide to Los Angeles. I'm just going to wrap up with 2 images. The next guide that we're working on is a guide to empathy and hate in the city of Los Angeles. So these are just 2 drawings from the guide. I have no idea how they're going to end up being useful in it. But that's what we're working on. Love and hate between people and policy.